When the last church bell stopped ringing and the final cart rolled through the street piled with bodies, the survivors stepped out blinking into the daylight of a changed world. Fields were untended, shops were shuttered. Some villages had entire homes sealed shut with red crosses still marked on the doors. She leaned against the cold stone, closed her eyes, and remembered. This was where she and her friends used to come after school to gossip and dream. Nature had taken a holiday. The familiar rituals had been disrupted. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The seasons turned, but life went on. People learned to live alongside the ghosts of the past. They told stories around flickering fires of those who had died, keeping their memories alive. Some found love again, offering comfort and solace to one another. Life had a way of persevering, of healing, of finding a way to carry on despite the heavy weight of loss. The survivors understood this now. They had no other choice. They tended their gardens, mended their houses, welcomed new life into the world. Yes, the world was changed, irrevocably changed. But they would ensure that it kept spinning, that the sun rose and set, that the seasons turned, that life, however different, went on. Birds no longer sang in the trees. Animals no longer grazed in the fields. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was as if the natural world was as stunned and saddened by the devastation as the humans. It was also dangerous. People went missing in the desolate countryside. Bandits roamed the roads, preying on the weak. Whole families disappeared, forcing others to flee their homes in the dead of night and hide in the forest. Wolves howled in the distance, but sometimes the shadows seemed to move on their own, detached from the trees, gliding through the undergrowth. People spoke in hushed voices of specters and wraiths wandering the land, searching for their lost loved ones. And though no one knew whether these stories were true or simply the product of a grief-addled mind, everyone knew that the dead were restless. Now the cobblestones around the well were stained a deep crimson, and the water, once so clear it mimicked the sky, was choked with debris and reeked of death. Her throat tightened. How could anyone ever move on from this? Many of the survivors still had the key to their house, but now it was a tomb. For every person who stayed behind, there was another empty chair at the table, another silent room in the house, another plot in the graveyard. Time, it seemed, had become a precious commodity. There wasn't much of it left for mourning. The rebuilding had to begin. Someone had to plant the crops. Someone had to man the barricades and watch for marauders. Someone had to collect firewood and draw water from the wells. People looked after each other as children, while others ventured into the abandoned fields to salvage what they could. With each sunrise, the survivors came together, shouldering their burdens in silence. They worked side by side, the living and the dead. For many, survival felt more like punishment than luck. They'd lost parents, siblings, friends. Some had buried them with their own hands only days before. And now they were expected to just move on. Easy to say, harder to do. In some places, half the population was simply gone. They emerged from the safety of their barricaded street to find their town a ghost of its former self. Homes were eerily silent. A young woman named Ilara found her way to an abandoned well in the village square. Across the ravaged countryside, people did their best to go about their lives. They had no choice. The world was eerily still. The old ways no longer held. Suddenly, everyone is looking for you. You're being offered food, clothes, money. People are fighting to get your attention. And if you agree to talk to them, they'll give you half of everything they have. What happened? So the peasants, once ignored, were now in demand. Lords needed workers desperately, and they had to pay. Wages rose. First, the Black Death swept through Europe, killing millions. And then came the famine, making life even harder for the survivors. But here's the thing, the rich landowners weren't prepared for what happened next. When the plague killed millions, when entire villages were wiped off the map, there weren't enough workers left to take care of the fields. The landowners needed people, and those people were in short supply. Peasants could demand better wages and better conditions. They could move from one farm to another. They could even set up their own farms because the fields were empty. A shepherd could earn more than a priest. For hundreds of years, European peasants were told that they weren't worth much. Well, you can find out if you watch another episode. The series is available on a streaming service, and if you watch the next episode, you'll learn how the rich tried to get their power back. They were born into a life of misery, and there was no hope of changing it. Suddenly, that changed. Suddenly, surviving meant you were valuable. It was a twisted reward, wealth earned from other people's deaths. But this power shift wouldn't last without a fight. People left their villages and went where the pay was good, ignoring the old feudal rules. The rich didn't like it, but they had no choice. They needed people to work the land so they could make some money. So they paid. In 1315, something terrible happened in Europe. Well, until that summer of 1316, the lives of European peasants were pretty miserable. They lived in tiny villages. They farmed the land owned by the rich lords. They paid rent in money or crops. They owed the lord all kinds of services, like making repairs to his land or working in his fields for free. If the lord needed a new road built, the peasants would work as unpaid laborers, and if there was a famine, they'd go hungry. Some managed to survive by becoming servants in noble households, taking care of the cooking, cleaning, and laundry. Others begged or stole to survive. Life was hard, wages were low, and most people couldn't read or write. If the men of the village wanted to get married, they had to ask permission from their landlord. He might say yes, he might say no. Sometimes the lord demanded a bride's dowry was so high, poor men could never afford it. This meant that sometimes the only way out of a village for a young person was to become a servant, to run away, or to join the army. It was a pretty bleak existence. A cold summer, a wet harvest, a mild winter, followed by an early spring. It seemed like the perfect year. And then came the summer of 1316. It started with hail, storms, and high winds that destroyed crops. Then the sun returned and it got really hot. By July, crops were drying up and people were desperate. It lasted for 7 years. Crops failed and people starved. One peasant later recalled, "I have sown wheat and barley with my own hand, and the crops did not amount to 1/10 of a bushel. In some areas, the population fell by 2/3. Whole villages were wiped off the map, and the survivors suddenly found themselves in a strange new world. They wouldn't expect it, but some survivors suddenly became rich. Landowners died with no heirs. Entire farms were left empty. But why? Why would the landowners have been so eager to share their wealth? And then came the plague. Let me repeat that. So what happened next? The year is 1348, and you are watching the Black Death roll across Europe, killing 1/3 of the population. The upper class panics. The peasants are leaving the land. They're like, "Nah, I'm good." In Germany, entire villages abandoned their manors and moved elsewhere. In England, the peasants seized castles and executed a sheriff. It was so bad that King Richard II had to escape to Normandy in disguise. The Black Death had cracked the system, and the survivors, the peasants and the nobles alike, weren't interested in putting it back together the same way. And then the king's like, "Oh, you're not good." It started when a group of about 200 men seized the town of Canterbury after hearing that the statute of laborers was being tested in court there. Starting with the weird ways that survivors of the plague dealt with the reality of being alive during a massive global pandemic. Check out the series in the description below. Word got around, and soon tens of thousands of peasants had joined them, demanding the end of serfdom, lower taxes, and an end to the power of the nobility. The rebels then marched on London, where they were met by King Richard, who agreed to meet with them. The talks went well, and it seemed like the peasants might actually get what they wanted. But then, a power struggle between the king and his counselors, and then suddenly Wat Tyler is dead. The other rebel leaders were arrested, and the statute of laborers remained in place for another 60 years. You're good for nothing. You regonna go back and do what you were doing before, or you'll be thrown in jail. And the peasants are like, "You can't do that. That would be rude." And then the king's like, "Watch me," and then the peasants revolt. This happened all over Europe. It just wasn't very well documented because most of the documents were destroyed during the revolt. The serfs are saying, "I want more." And the kings are like, "Screw that, we're passing some laws." Like, for example, in 1351, the English king passed the Statute of Laborers, which basically said, Wages shall be as they were before the pestilence, or as they are commonly called, the plague. And laborers shall not demand higher wages under pain of having their wages reduced to the value of a day's labor, and not to exceed that at the will and pleasure of the justices of the peace. It was also illegal for workers to leave their manors without permission. If they did, they could be put in jail. Kings and queens are dropping like flies, and entire communities are being wiped out. Then something really weird happens. Now, this was a problem because while the plague was horrible, it also presented an opportunity for those who survived. See, before the plague, there were very few jobs, and many people, especially in the countryside, were tied to the land as serfs, basically working for the landowner as a condition of their existence, getting just enough food and housing to survive. They had no rights, and their lives were completely controlled by the whims of the rich landowners. But during the plague, when whole villages were dying and being abandoned, these poor serfs got a taste of freedom. They could go live in a city where they could make more money. They could work for different landowners. They could finally be their own bosses. So when the king says, "Hey, let's put this plague break on pause and go back to how things were before," in France, the peasants rose up and murdered 4 nobles. But the most famous peasant revolt was probably Wat Tyler's rebellion in 31 in England. But just because the peasants lost this battle doesn't mean that feudalism was saved. For more about what came next, and thank you for watching. When you picture a survivor of the Black Death, what do you see? Someone gaunt and gray-faced, wasting away from the plague? Or perhaps someone with a crown of boils, skin lesions oozing and weeping on their flesh? Those images are indeed what it was like to have the Black Death in the 14th century, but not all the scars it left behind were visible ones. Bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. The bubonic type, the most common, caused painful swellings or buboes in the groin, armpits, and neck. Dedicating their lives to God in hopes of saving their souls after the harrowing experience, others stopped believing in anything. A poem from the time reads, "Alas, what aileth this world, that men should live so evil and so wickedly, that if any man turn to good, men hold him a heretic." Maybe it's better not to be too good, she says, because people will think you're a heretic. Survivors may have questioned everything they'd once believed in and now rejected organized religion. These were caused by infected lymph nodes trying to fight off the bacteria, or those who spent years locked up in their houses, unable to bring themselves to go outside. People didn't understand mental illness then and had no vocabulary for things like post-traumatic stress disorder, but the effects were very real. The trauma of the Black Death lingered for years, sometimes for the survivors' whole lives. Some never married again, others partied or sinned like there was no tomorrow. And maybe that's how they saw it. After death stalked them for years, killing everyone they knew, they may have decided to grab life by the horns and do whatever they wanted. Then came the fever, weakness, chills, headache, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, leaving survivors to pick up the pieces and rebuild. To learn more ways that it changed the course of history, stay tuned for more information. Skin lesions would soon appear, oozing and weeping on the flesh. Those with the pneumonic form of the plague developed a horrible cough, bloody sputum, and chest pains. This was because the bacteria had traveled to the lungs. Septicemic was the worst. This is when the bacteria got into the blood, turning the blood itself to poison. All 3 forms were deadly, but septicemic was the absolute worst. Its mortality rate was close to 100. Some survivors suffered mentally in ways that medieval people didn't fully understand. Hello, and welcome to this channel. Today we're talking about how the Black Death may have affected its survivors. We've said before that the Black Death was one of the most devastating natural selection events in history. Some were paranoid. Every cough sounded like a death sentence. Every new fever or illness brought back memories of the horrible illness that had nearly killed them. Medieval people didn't have an understanding of contagious disease or how to prevent it, so they blamed each other for spreading illness. Survivors may have also blamed themselves for surviving while so many others died. They may have been haunted by visions of their loved ones who died or felt survivor-esque guilt over losing some and not others. There is evidence that people began to isolate themselves in their homes for fear of infecting others, or going crazy with worry that they might be carrying the disease. From 1346 to 1353, it is estimated that it killed about 25 million people in Eurasia. That's about 30 to 50% of the population. It arrived in Europe in the summer of 1347, carried by fleas on rats, which jumped ship from a larger vessel onto the bustling English coastal town of Bristol. Within a year, it had made its way across the continent into North Africa and the Middle East. At first, the symptoms were so bizarre and terrifying that people had no idea what was happening. There were three main types of Black Death. Even those who survived were changed by their experience. Some survivors turned deeply religious. Then there were the people who began walking around talking to the dead, thinking that they could hear them. The Black Death wiped out between a third and a half of the population of Europe. Entire communities were decimated. The year is 1348 and you are dying of the plague. Let's say that you're one of the lucky ones, though. You survive the initial fever, the aches, the lesions, and somehow you're still alive as the weeks crawl by and your entire family and most of your friends have died. With the church shaken and priests dying in droves, you're looking for answers. Corpses, bodies of every size litter the landscape, too big to bury and too small to leave alone. Believed that they could stop the plague, at least in some small way. But they endangered everyone around them by spreading disease through their flagellation camps. Those who blamed the Jews rounded up their neighbors and fellow villagers and beat them to death, perpetuating deadly conspiracy theories that had no basis in reality. Even those who escaped the worst of the plague had to live with the consequences of that plague. For years, Europe never looked the same after the plague, and neither did the world. Many survivors reacted to this plague-ridden world by building mass graves. Meanwhile, for more information about the Black Death, including additional resources, check out our website. This series was produced by me and my amazing team of researchers and editors. If you liked this episode, let us know by subscribing to the channel and leaving a review. Thanks for watching. Filling them with the bodies of their loved ones and strangers alike, covering them with earth and moving on. Those who died young, whose parents were taken by the plague, they fared worse. Sometimes their bodies were left where they fell, sometimes they were thrown into mass graves, often without ceremony or even being properly dead. Because if you were a survivor, you knew that the plague could linger for months, killing even those who seemed recovered. So, if someone wasn't breathing and didn't have a pulse, well, you might leave them where they were, just in case. Maybe you turned to flagellation. That was when groups of men would march through towns, whipping themselves to atone for mankind's sins. Or maybe you blame the Jews. After all, that's what some folks in your village have done, rounding up the local Jews and beating them to death. Or maybe you fall in with the astrologers who say that only those born under certain signs were spared the plague and you were or you do as some others did and drink a magic potion to cure yourself. Maybe you don't bother with any of that because you're convinced that the world has ended. In fact, apocalyptic thinking became widespread during the plague years, and those who survived believed that they'd been spared for a divine reason. So they wandered the countryside preaching, seeking out other survivors to tell them that the end times were here and only they could bring them salvation. There were also plenty of mystics and fortune-tellers who claimed to be able to divine people as futures and whether they meet their end at the hands of the plague. People turned to all kinds of weird, dangerous ideas because the plague had opened a door and a flood of weird, dangerous ideas came pouring through. This is a series about the Black Death. If you want more episodes, please subscribe. Now, let's go back to 1348. With so many people dying, it's unsurprising that when you wander outside, you see corpses littering the ground. But once you get past that, what do you see? If you're someone who lived through the plague, your vision of the world will be irrevocably changed. First, there's the landscape itself. The fields are overgrown because there aren't enough people to work them. Wheat is rotting in the fields as the vines take over. Entire villages may be abandoned, their houses empty, and their streets without the sound of children. It's hard to imagine, but Europe was 50% less populated after the plague than it had been before. All those open fields, those empty houses, they remained for decades. In fact, survivors who lost everything during the plague often didn't move away from their home villages. Instead, they simply built new lives in the ruins of the old, planting crops in the middle of empty streets or making their homes in derelict buildings. But as you walk through these empty towns and overgrown fields, you'll also see something else, something truly horrific. There were no easy choices in the time of the plague. Flagellants, those who whipped themselves as penance. Next time on the Past and Prologue podcast, we'll talk about how the plague affected art, literature, and music. After the plague, fewer babies were born. That might sound like a great thing for the babies. People who survived the plague often lost one or both parents, sometimes an entire generation of family members. This is a story about the children of the plague, but another theory says that the plague actually made more babies possible. Yes, fewer stories about the carts, the bells, and the smell of death. Those children grew up and took over the world of late medieval Europe. Some historians say they were stronger, braver, more ambitious than the generations that came before them. The darkness of people not understanding how diseases spread, the darkness of not knowing that rats were the culprit. And yet it led to a brighter time, the Renaissance. Maybe living through the plague made them appreciate life a little more, or maybe they felt like they had something to prove, like they had to do more with their lives than the generation that died. Or maybe it was just that there was less competition for jobs and land because there were fewer people. Whatever the reason, this new generation would lead the late medieval world into big changes. Like the Renaissance, a word that means rebirth. That last part might not sound like a blessing. People began exploring the world, making discoveries and challenging ideas that had been around for hundreds of years. In some ways, the children of the plague were responsible for it. After all, the plague had wiped the slate clean, killing off so many people that it changed the way people thought. The bubonic plague had killed off so many people in Europe that the survivors had to change the way they farmed, worked, even the way they thought about the world. But for the children who grew up hearing those tales, it was all they knew. Before the plague, Europe was full of people, not just humans, but livestock too. Fields were small and it was hard to get enough food for everyone. There just wasn't enough to go around. But after the plague, there was more food for the survivors and more fields to plant in because so many people had died. Those people who lived through the plague and had the means to plant crops or raise livestock could produce more food than they needed. So while there were fewer mouths to feed, there was also more food available. The result was that people didn't have to worry as much about where their next meal would come from, which meant they could start thinking about having a family. The ones who grew up believing the stories about the carts, the bells, and the smell of death. We don't know exactly how many children were born during or right after the plague, but we do know that there were fewer births than before the plague and fewer still right after it hit. And when the survivors took over the farms and businesses of the people who died, they weren't yet old enough to remember what it was like before the plague. It was almost like starting a new life. After all, that means more food for the ones that did arrive. More land too, since fewer people meant more space per person. But it also meant growing up hearing terrifying stories from your parents about the carts, the bells, and the smell of death. When the plague struck, entire families were wiped out. In fact, some historians say they did start a new era in human history. It might seem like an obvious conclusion that people were just scared to have babies when there was a deadly disease going around. Whatever the reason, fewer babies meant a world with fewer people, more space, more food, and as the years went by and the memory of the plague began to fade, it was a time when people started to value art, science, and culture again. And that's ironic because the plague itself was born out of darkness. The darkness of dirty, crowded cities, but only after a lot of darkness. That's 1 minute. See you tomorrow? Let's imagine for a moment that you are a survivor. The bombs have fallen or the plague has passed or your village has been sacked and burned. You and a few thousand others are the sole survivors of an apocalyptic event that has ravaged your nation. Now what? The impulse might be to find someone or something to blame, to come up with a grand narrative that explains why it happened and to try to prevent it from ever happening again. These turning points that alter the course of nations and decide that those are the important things. It's filled with pain and sorrow and suffering, but it's also full of ordinary people doing extraordinary things every day, just trying to get by, just trying to keep going. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we can ask for. But history is also full of quiet, ordinary moments, too. Moments that don't change the world, but that allow the world to keep turning. There were stories of survival during the Holocaust and the Syrian Civil War and the AIDS crisis and World War II and the Great Depression. There were stories of refugees fleeing war and persecution and finding new lives for themselves in strange lands. There were stories of people holding on to their faith and their traditions in the face of unimaginable adversity. And there were stories of ordinary people helping other ordinary people in extraordinary times. A farmer in the Middle Ages clearing a field for planting, because I believe that they can give us strength and hope for our own struggles. If you would like to share your story of resilience, please send it to the email below. Who knows? Your story might just help someone else keep going when the world seems like it might end. A merchant in Victorian England balancing his books, a mother in the 1950s fixing a meal for her family, a man in the 20th century sweeping the sidewalk in front of his house. These are the moments that add up to a life. And maybe that's all any of us can do, add up to a life and then let life go on. But if there is anything that we know from history, it is that pandemics and wars and disasters, they happen again and again. New diseases emerge, new conflicts arise, new catastrophes strike. And even when we know what's coming, we don't always have the power to stop it. What would you do with your life now? The truth is most survivors probably didn't do anything to change the world. Okay, let me rephrase that. Survivors almost certainly didn't do anything to change the world. They were ordinary people doing extraordinary things every day just to get by. But I think we can learn something from them. Would you rise up against the oppressors? Write a book about your experiences? Take up arms to defend your homeland? Become the leader of the free people? Most survivors didn't do any of those things. Most survivors didn't become rich or powerful. They didn't revolt or write history, they just kept going. They rebuilt homes, planted crops, raised children. They made jokes again, celebrated weddings, lit candles for the dead and passed down stories of the great pestilence or the burning times or when the bombs fell, stories of neighbors who disappeared and of how the birds stopped singing for a time. Their legacy is hidden, not in books, but in the fact that life returned. Streets were swept. Bells rang again. Bread was baked, they survived, and they made the world livable again. Quietly, patiently. And that might be the bravest thing of all. In the aftermath of extreme trauma, so then what do? How do we go on living in a world where bad things happen over and over and over again? We focus on the small things, we make the bread, we plant the crops, we raise the children. In other words, we keep going. It's easy to look at history and see these huge dramatic events. The world can be a dark and dangerous place. A few weeks ago, I asked you guys to send me stories of resilience from your own family's history. And you guys really delivered. These are the stories that I want to tell more of here on this channel.